Yeah, that's right. I'll just change. We can just pause the recording just now because we only record during the.
So I'm Antoine de Mailleux. I'm last year PhD student at U Saint-Louis in Brussels. During my PhD, what I study is the effect of taxes and benefit systems on the behavior of people. And one of the topics I studied is how social benefits will push people to form households. And so regarding the basic income, it's an important question because basic income is an individual benefit. And while the current social protection systems in most of European countries, it's not individual, which means that if you live alone or if you live with someone else, you will not receive the same benefits. So I will first give a bit extra information on the current social protection systems in Europe. So means tested social benefits in most European countries depend on the household structure. So for example, the number of children, the number of adults, etc. And the rationale behind this is that large households, they benefit from economies of scale in their expenses. For example, if you live with someone else, you only need to pay one rent because you live together. Also, you heat only one apartment, etc. And so you have lower per capita cost of living. And so, for example, in Belgium, if you live alone as an adult, you are eligible to 985 euros per month of social assistance. While if you cohabit with your partner, then you can only receive 656 euros per month per person. And so the implied equivalence scales differ from country to country. So in Belgium, you receive 2/3 of what a single receives if you cohabit. But in Europe, it varies from 52% to 100%. This is what you can see on this first graph. So for all the European countries that have a guaranteed minimum income scheme, you have the benefits you can receive as a single in dark blue, and the benefits you can receive as a cohabitant in light blue. And so you see that there is quite some variation in Europe. And on this second graph, you see here the ratio between the cohabitant amount and the isolated amount, or the single amount. So, for example, in Denmark, it makes no difference. If you live alone or with other people, you will receive the same benefits. But if you look at the other extreme, Belgium, Spain, Croatia, Malta, for example, you have a big difference. You receive less than 75% of the full benefit when you live with other adults. And then the second observation that leads to this research is that many field reports, among others in Belgium and Netherlands, mention that those means tested social assistance benefits have adverse effects, because it prevents poor people to move in together, or it renders cohabitation financially difficult. Also, it can lead to inefficiencies on the lower segment of the housing market, because in some cases you have people renting a cheap room on a different address just to, on paper, be living alone and receive the full benefits. And in Netherlands, there is also a big problem that when a child becomes adult, the benefits of the parents will decrease because you have more adults in the household. And so some reports say that it pushes young adults into homelessness. And to those issues, you can add privacy issues. You can add the administrative cost of controlling household composition, and also difficulty to draw a line between cohabitant and isolated, because in some cases you have people living in different rooms in the same house that don't really know each other, for example. And the third observation is that there are many movements that are in favor of individualized social rights. and the suppression of the cohabitant status. And those movements are, in Belgium at least, left-wing political parties, gender equality movements, anti-poverty movements, and other interest groups. But so far, it has never been really on a top priority for the government, because it's budgetary costs, and also some arguments said that if you increase too much the benefits for cohabitants to the level of what a single received, then you create unemployment traps. But recently, this cohabitation status was suppressed for disability benefits. And so the questions I address in this research is, to what extent do equivalent scales implied by social assistance schemes affect household formation? What are the consequences on government expenses if you increase the benefits for cohabitants, or if you individualize social benefits? And the normative arguments also, but this is not treated here in this presentation, but you can see it in the paper that is attached to my profile. And the focus of this paper is childless adults. And so just to underline again the link with the basic income. So as you know, the UBI policies, they differ from traditional social assistance benefits in 3 dimensions, because first, they do not take into account the means of a person versus the means status benefits that exist in most countries. Secondly, UBI do not require labor market availability, while currently you are mostly obliged to search and accept job offers. And the third aspect that I study is that UBI, the level of the benefit received does not depend on the number of household members, while here currently benefits decrease with the number of adults in the household. And so I run a statistical analysis, and I test the effect of BEC, so the benefit for cohabitants, on the cohabitation rates in different countries. And secondly, I will estimate the costs of increasing the benefit cohabitants receive. So for this, I use data coming from Euromod country reports. So Euromod is a micro-simulation model that covers all the European countries. And in those reports, you have the detailed information on social protection schemes in Europe. And so I take from there benefits that singles and cohabitants are eligible to, and I create a variable rho that is a ratio between both of them. And then I also use the EU SILK service to have information on the household composition and the information on whether a household receives social assistance benefits. And so I create a dummy that will be used in the regression that indicates whether a household is eligible to and actually receives social assistance benefits. I run 3 regressions. So my dependent variable is if is a dummy indicating whether a person cohabits or not. And on the right hand side, I add the benefit levels, the ratio between cohabitant amount and single amount, and some control variables. In model 2, I add some other covariates. And in model 3, I also check whether social assistance parameters affect non-socially assisted individuals. And so on this slide, you have the results. So it's a probit model. And you see the parameter of interest here is the rho. And you see that when you increase the rho, so if you increase the benefits you give to cohabitants, you will increase the share of cohabiting poor individuals significantly. Here on the right, you have the marginal effects, but I will give some figures for Belgium to give a bit more intuition. So, for example, yes, okay, sorry. First, one of the results, we see that there is a strong negative correlation between being socially assisted and cohabiting. So if you are poor and socially assisted, you are much more likely to live alone. And secondly, the effect of the rho. You see that the marginal effect is about 0.7 percentage points increase when rho increased by 1 percentage point. So concretely, it would mean that in Belgium, if you increase benefits cohabitants receive from 595 to 603, you would increase the share of cohabiting socially assisted from 21.5 to 22.1. And so if you would increase the cohabitant amount a lot to be at the same level as the single amounts, you see that you would significantly increase the number of cohabitants. And then I also study what are the budgetary costs of increasing benefits for cohabitants. So what happens regarding the government budget? So when two socially assisted individuals start cohabiting, the government will only have to pay BC to them instead of BS. And so the difference between BC and BS will be a saving for the government. And so what I call the cost recovery rate is actually the savings resulting from this effect divided by the direct costs. So the additional euros you pay to cohabitants. And so here in the right column of this graph, of this table, sorry, you see an estimation of this cost recovery rate. Taking again Belgium as an example, you see that you recover almost everything of the extra expenses you would have when you increase the benefits for cohabitants. So this means that you pay a bit more to cohabitants. So this will incentivize single poor individuals to move in together. And because of that, the government pay to them a lower benefit. And so in the end, it's almost neutral for the government. So in a short summary of this research, so the first findings is that social assistance benefits are differentiated according to household composition and that equivalent scales used differ strongly within Europe. I use this variation to estimate effect on household formation of adults without children. And then the findings, the social assistance parameters significantly affect household formation of the poorest, and that increasing cohabitants benefits is less costly than one might think, as savings result from the fact more individuals will cohabit. And so it also gives some indication that basic income policies would push more poor single people to move in together to benefit from economies of scales.
How are you doing, Anton? Have you more to say, or are you?
No,
okay.
No.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. We'll now head on to the second presentation, which is the state of UBI, mapping out arguments for and against UBI. And this is co-authored by a number of people: Mariusz Oskowski, Lucas Segal, Victoria Malavka and Dominic Afsharian. I believe Dominic and Marius are going to present the presentation this afternoon. Dominic and Marius, please introduce yourselves and give a little background to the paper and go ahead. Can I also, before we do start the next session, remind people, please write questions in the question and answer or comments in the chat options in the Whova app. If that's a difficult thing for you to do, you can raise your hand during the question and answer, and myself and Alice will check out for people who maybe want to ask a question direct to camera. So please go ahead now,
Okay.
and Marius. Thank you.
Yes, okay. The way we'll do it is that I'll start off by giving some introductions to our research, where we've come from and how we've conducted it, and then I'll hand over to Dominic about a third to half of the way through so he can go into the nuts and bolts of everything we've done. Okay, so thank you all very much for joining us in the session today. We're very excited to present our research to you. As you can see in front of you, you have our 4 beautiful faces and our contact details. So if you have any questions about our research, please drop us a line. We 4 met as a result of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies Young Academics Network program, and we agreed to come up with a project that maps onto our shared interests despite coming from quite different disciplinary backgrounds. Dominic's a political scientist, I'm a historian, political theorist, Victoria Malafka is a sociologist, and Lucas is a philosopher. So you can see we've got interest in basic income coming from very different areas. And our project there is on a European universal basic income. And we'll have a paper coming out on that. It should be within the next couple of months or so. We're very happy to keep anyone who's interested posted about how that develops. Follow us on our social media and you'll be able to find out that as well. But what we've done here, as part of the research for this particular paper, we realized that it would be very helpful to get a strong sense of where, what the state of the debate is. What are the arguments for and against UBI that have been used across the board by people from different backgrounds, from a journalistic or academic or more party political or activist kind of background. And the reason for this is that it's very clear to see that we have a wave of resurgence of interest in basic income within popular opinion. There's liters and gallons of ink has been spilled on it in academic scholarship. And of course, we have parties engaging with it quite extensively as well. But there's a certain amount of balkanization, as we call it in the paper, in that supporters and opponents of universal basic income, or indeed basic income more broadly construed, tend to engage with the themes of the debate from very different angles, often using very different terms. And that can lead to a very inaccessible and quite misleading set of arguments on either side. This is also problematized by the fact that it has a long history as a concept, going back to people as far as Vives and Thomas More, people like Thomas Paine, Condorcet, in the immediate early 20th century, Dennis and Mabel Milner, Bertrand Russell, Judy H. Cole, and then in the mid 20th century, Milton Friedman, Martin Luther King. People who really don't agree on very much at all, and obviously writing in very different social, political, and economic contexts, have all engaged with this debate. And all of their thoughts are fed into the very fragmented and very decentralized state the debate has right now, which is interesting because as a policy, as an idea, it's actually very simple. That's partly why it's so popular. It's very accessible as an idea, but because of all these different arguments and different authors that have engaged with it, there's a lot of room for contradictory interpretations, especially when it comes to ways of realizing basic income and what other kind of policies it should or could be paired with. So on that basis, we thought it's high time to take stock of where the debate is right now, the thematic contours of the UBI debate, to look at what we might call the morphology of basic income, so the shape of the arguments and concepts that tie in with it. And the reason we thought we needed to write a separate paper for it is because a lot of the existing attempts at offering something like this, summarizing the debate, often they are instrumental. They're there to contextualize. Often they're written then in introduction to edited volumes or into a paper that's about a particular aspect of UBI. They're there as a contextualizing tool. They're not actually focused on they're not intrinsically focused on the question of mapping itself. Often they are skewed towards surveying the arguments in favor of UBI. Why? Because the actual piece of work in itself is there to either deny or refute or solve the arguments against UBI. Sometimes the summaries are presented more as a list, perhaps even a chronology, a sort of whistle-stop tour through people who have engaged with UBI, which isn't particularly systematic because it doesn't really focus on thematic similarities and differences. Sometimes they rely on a limited number of sources, focusing either on exclusively academic papers or on journalistic output, but not everything that fits into the category in total. And in some cases, there's a more limited or partial thematic focus. They might be more interested in the philosophical underpinnings of UBI, or they might be more interested in the fiscal aspect of UBI, but not, again, across the board. So what did we do? Well, we took an open-minded approach within certain parameters of high-quality discussion towards popular and public debates, commentary on UBI, political advocacy statements, so partisan and more campaign group style, organizational reports from major international bodies, commentary on different media platforms, newspapers, and so on. And we conducted what you might call a semantic or a conceptual analysis of what's going on in each of these different things. So we extrapolated the underlying shared logic of the arguments that we compiled, both for and against UBI. And through an iterative process of thematic categorization, we initially came to a tripartite division that we found arguments that are social, arguments that are economic, and arguments that are political for and against UBI. And then through more iterative refinement and reworking, both independently and as a collective we worked out a number of subcategories within each one, which come to a total of 7. And I think this is a good point to hand over to Dominic to talk about what those categories and subcategories are.
Thank you, Marius, for this introduction. And I'll just jump right into essentially what is, quote unquote, the meat of our paper. So because we identified a bunch of different themes of arguments for and against UBI, we broke them down in 3 categories of themes. And you'll see in a minute why this makes a lot of sense and why this might be really interesting, especially for advocates for a universal basic income. So the first category we identified concerns core principles of UBI, and it's essentially comprised of 2 main themes: social justice and equality on the one hand, and freedom and the individual on the other hand. And the arguments you can find in these themes are not only defined by the contents of these themes themselves, but also by one very interesting attribute, namely that they very much work with normative judgments, and not only normative judgments whether UBI is desirable or not, but normative judgments whether essentially regarding philosophical concerns. Imagine you enter the UBI debate for the first time. You probably won't enter as a clean slate, politically speaking. You already have your normative preferences, and this really plays a big role here. Let me just give you a few examples for arguments used for and against UBI in these themes, and please keep in mind the arguments on our slides are just examples. You can find a very thorough list in our paper. So regarding social justice, people might argue for UBI, well, it's great because it prevents discrimination, whereas others might argue, no, it's not really just because it ignores needs, contributions, and distribution. Regarding freedom and the individual, people might argue, oh, it's great because it's emancipatory, or people might argue, no, it's not really that good of an idea because it reinforces extreme individualism, and people might forget how to live independently. But if you look at these arguments, you'll see that empirical evidence won't really get you far if you argue with somebody for or against UBI who has these positions, because these are inherently normative questions based on philosophical considerations that people had before. So in other words, if you encounter these arguments in UBI debates, you might have to address or find another route to argue for or against UBI, depending on what your goal is, because you won't be likely to change the people's underlying assumptions of what is just or not. In stark contrast to that, the second category of themes, UBI and the capitalist society, is heavily economically influenced. It consists of the themes of arguments under business and consumption and under labor, work, and employment. And here, in stark contrast to the first category, you'll find that most arguments that are used can be addressed with empirical evidence because they largely rely on assumptions of what might actually happen. For example, people might argue that UBI will stimulate business development, or that it will enhance the consumption of harmful goods such as drugs, or that UBI will abolish bullshit jobs, or that it will be a negative work incentive, the latter being a very famous one. And here, of course, this is where empirical evidence really shines, because while there might be normative connotations to these things, most of them work with actual assumptions of empirics. And this is where a lot of the UBI debate is currently focused on, especially of proponents. As you saw during the Congress already, there are experiments and case studies being carried out to address these points. So we have one category of arguments that, irrespective of its contents, works very philosophically and normative, and one that works with assumptions and very empirically, very economically. Well, the last category moves it from the economy to the level, to the political level, essentially, and that is UBI and the state, which is a category of arguments that is, an animal of its own. It has three main themes under it. That is welfarism and the welfare state, taxation and public expenditure, and essentially issues around democracy, citizenship, and such. And the reason why this category is really interesting and fascinating is because it strongly combines normative and empirical claims. So we find under welfarism and the welfare state that proponents say UBI is great because it closes gaps in the existing systems, whereas opponents might say, well, it might replace the welfare state insufficiently and therefore be actually a social step backwards. Regarding taxation and public expenditure, we find arguments like, hey, it's great if we want redistribution because we can use it, depending on the funding, to essentially achieve redistribution through the back door. However, it might also be very expensive. You're aware of this argument. And where it really becomes interesting is the theme of democracy and citizenship, because this really illustrates where we have this clash of normative and empirical arguments. Proponents might argue it strengthens participation, whereas opponents might argue that it weakens collective cohesion. And whereas you might say now, okay, this is all clearly very normative. However, if you think about it, the first arguments in particular, so the pro-arguments here, they're actually in Western democracies, they're not really controversial. You will hardly find a majority of people who would say, well, it's bad if we have improved participation, or it's bad if we have strong citizenship. So therefore, the normative aspect of this is something that's not really important or controversial in UBI debates if you think about it. Rather, what's really important here is the empirics. Will that actually deliver on this promise that everybody shares? And the issue here is that this is really hard to prove, because these are large-scale effects that are really hard to prove in empirical case studies, whereas the negative arguments here are clearly normative in the sense that it will be much more controversial to say, well, we want a collectivist versus an individualist society. But what does this all tell us? What are the key takeaways here, especially for advocates who might want to push through UBI? Well, one key finding that we find interesting is that proponents often argue idealistically, at least initially. They often say, well, UBI is great because it will lead us to this utopian society. And opponents often react pragmatically. And the reason why this is effective for opponents of UBI, imagine you have an audience. You are arguing for UBI, somebody else is arguing against UBI, and somebody in the audience is impartial. And that person in the audience might agree with your idealistic goals, but opponents might easily say, well, this all sounds nice, but it's not achievable. So therefore, proponents became really good at addressing these empirical arguments with empirical case studies. The problem here is, though, and this is where it really becomes tricky at the moment, opponents can always rely and fall back to the justice arguments. So they can always use this as a line of defense. Oh, great, you now have these empirical findings, but this doesn't matter because UBI still ignores contribution, distribution, and so on, needs, for example. And this leads us to an argumentative deadlock that we're in the UBI debate right now. Proponents might feel like they're making a lot of progress, but opponents still have these arguments to fall back on. And a very clear kind of thing that we can do now, if we want to move the debate forward, no matter into which direction, is to attach arguments for or against UBI to societal ideas of justice. So much more than only figuring out whether UBI would empirically be beneficial, it's really important to reflect on what are the guiding ideas of justice in the society I as a person live in, and then to attach UBI to this. And this might then actually, and this is after all the theme of this Congress, lead to an actual push for implementation, because much of the stalemate politically that we observe is essentially up to a matter of political will. We heard before that many parties support UBI, but the really, really big parties are kind of an issue. In many countries, not even social democrats, who should theoretically support it, you might think, don't really support it. And one way we can really kind of combine these things that we found is that we can address certain critical points through policy design. So if you propose a policy design for UBI, don't only think about what would work empirically most efficiently, but also think about what is really important to the critical stakeholders you're engaging with. Social democrats, for example, they're really happy about the welfare state, and it is a big achievement. So what could you do? Well, you could address this potential drawback of replacing the welfare state by arguing, well, everything remains in place except those cash transfers that are one-to-one replaced by UBI. And then you might resolve an issue with justice that social democrats have, and then all that's left to do is show empirically why it is potentially a good idea. And now the last point, and I'll wrap it up with that to make it easier on everybody else, because we've been talking for a while now, is that pro-welfare actors are in a way in a paradoxical situation, as we observed. So social democratic parties are a good example for that. There are many pro-welfare actors that are afraid that UBI would replace the welfare state in an insufficient way. So therefore they conclude, let's stay away from this. But the consequence of this is that actors who are against welfare engage with UBI essentially in a monopoly. So they define what UBI means, essentially then offering an example or a policy proposal of a very salient and popular policy that is then the monopoly and might very well be implemented, leading to a situation where the fact that pro-welfare actors wanting to avoid this situation actually caused it indirectly through their inaction. So long story short, it is particularly important for pro-welfare proponents of UBI to engage also with the ideas of justice that are prevalent in their society. But yeah, we're going to leave it with that. Thank you so much for your attention, and we're really looking forward to your questions and the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Marius and Dominic. That was it was very stimulating and interesting. Just remind people to please put comments and questions in the chat and the question and answer box within the Hoover app, but obviously also at the end of the final part of this presentation, we will be asking people, also giving you the option to raise your hands if you want to ask a question that way. So the final part of our presentation this morning is towards an answer to the question, what is a basic income? Part 1, what is the name? What is in the name? So Télémaque Masson will be presenting then of a basic income and the scope for acceptance or rejection of the idea. So Télémaque, if you're ready to take the stage, please go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. My bad. Yeah. So no. Okay. Sorry, can you see? I can't see you anymore, but can you see my slide right now?
Yes.
Yes.
And is it moving now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, the main argument I'm going to be making here is somehow an answer to the previous presentation. So I look forward to the discussion. But basically, my main point would be that at least since the creation of Bien, the notion of basic income has had two distinct understanding, though they were they're confused with one another. So the first one is a narrow understanding of a formal way to distribute resources defined by 6 formal criteria, and there's another broader understanding as the aspiration to the universal and unconditional guarantee of the material means of individual autonomy, which is a mouthful, but it's the most concise way I've found to express it so far. And then finally, I'll try to very briefly at the end look at how we can use this distinction to map out the basic income debate somehow like what was done before. So the first point, I'd start just with this quote from Walter Weintraub, who was one of the founding members of Bien and the first one to attempt to write the history of the basic income debate. The point is that there's the importance of Bien's definition of basic income is often underrated, because until, before Bien set a definition of basic income, it was virtually impossible to make a history of it and to build a scientific community around it. And virtually all the proponents that came before Bien were under the impression that they were the first one to discover the idea. And my slides are not moving anymore. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you,
Okay.
but your slides are stuck, unfortunately.
Well, this is okay. Okay, so I can try. So the first point I was going to make was about and the narrow understanding of basic income, and this starts from the Bien's definition. Bien's definition is actually, Bien has actually had 3 definitions in history. The first one at its creation in 86, then its first constitution in 88, and then it was substantially modified in 2016. The way it was modified in 2016 was to narrow the meaning of basic income towards the narrow meaning of a policy tool, of a way to distribute resources, according to 5 criteria. So originally in 86 and 85, it was only individual, unconditional as in without activity tests, and universal as in to all without means tests. And then in 2016 was added the criteria of the fact that it should be periodic and not a one-time payment. So essentially excluding the basic capital arguments from the Bien scene, and the fact that it should be paid in cash and not in kind, which was itself an answer to the pressure of the intensification of the debate around cash transfer and some proposal from the degrowth scene of paying basic income only in kind. The issue with this, and the thing is, both of these modifications that were added in 2016, I'm still not getting my slides back, whatever, were argued by some to have been implicit since the very beginning, since the creation of Bien, since 1986. But in fact, it turns out that actually the notion of basic income in kind was actually used by as prominent supporters of basic income as Philippe Van Parijs, co-founder of Bien, and Jürgen de Wispeley, who organized, amongst other things, at least 2 Bien congresses in respectively 1995 and 2004. And so, but anyway, this can still be seen as a progress in the definition of the narrow understanding of basic income of the policy tool, as the product of the proposal being taken more seriously. But still, arguably concerning that narrow meaning, there's one point that is still lacking to be able to use basic income efficiently as a tool of policy analysis, which is the notion of the uniformity of payment, the fact that the payments made by a basic income should be the same to all of the recipients, which is also a point that Annie Miller will be arguing about tomorrow morning, but slightly differently. So here, my point there was so in my first Black Congress in 2012, Philippe, in his closing remarks, insisted on the fact that what he called the crucial conjunction between universality and unconditionality, which is at the heart of basic income. And I definitely agree, and I think this is a crucial conjunction to both the narrow and broad meaning. But I think when we look at the narrow meaning of basic income, we have to pay attention to another crucial conjunction, which is that between uniformity and universality. And to understand that one, we need to we need firstly to understand more things about universality and more misunderstandings about universality. So the point boils down in one expression. It's the notion that the universality always stops at the limits of the universe. Actually, I had a nice slide with some stuff of astrophysics, but whatever, because I went to look into this notion of where does the universe stop, and there's some really fascinating stuff there, but for the sake of time and not having my slides, let's move on. So basically the point is, when you apply this to social policy, it means every universal social policy has to first define its universe of applicability. And so a case in point is the notion of universal suffrage. It's a universal voting right, which actually, as some of you may know, Philippe was Philippe Van Parijs first called his basic income, he called universal grant, in a direct reference to universal suffrage. And so the point is, universal suffrage, when it was first introduced, was limited to, say, male citizen of 21 years of age. But then the other point of universal policies is that almost by definition, calling a policy universal implies that it will try to outgrow the limits you initially set to it. And so again, universal suffrage is a case in point. The voting right limited to male of 21 years of age, almost everywhere where it was implemented, extended to first to women, and then the age lowered, and in many places, resident foreigners are allowed the right to vote. And so with this, there's three main, so okay, this is great regards universal policies, but what does it say, tells us about basic income? So there's, I think, three main points here, which I had. The first one is that when we look at a basic income proposal that supposedly pays a lower amount to children than it does to adults, for instance, analytically, it seems that we're better off, and it's more efficient to think of it as not a single basic income policy that pays two different amounts, but as actually two distinct, analytically distinct basic income schemes with this, that each matched all the 6 characteristics, including uniformity. Okay. This is also very interesting and instrumental because it allows one to understand why those negative income taxes that match all of these criteria, and crucially the uniformity one, are basic income. So in the field of negative taxes, some of or subsidies, some of them are negative income taxes, so subsidies that go through the income tax, and in those, a small subset respect all of the 6 formal criteria of the narrow meaning of basic income, and these just are basic income. And the third point, I can't remember right now, and I don't have my slides, so it will come back later. One important thing with all this was to oppose so in their 2017 basic income book, Philippe and Yannick try to define a basic income. Oh, sorry, my bad. My third point towards this narrow understanding of basic income is that actually, if you take this seriously, we already have around the world many narrow meaning basic income in existence. And I mean, much more than just the much talked about Alaska public Alaska PFD, the dividend from the Alaskan oil, or the income from casinos in Macau. We have many existing narrow meaning basic income schemes, such as every single universal child benefits system or universal pension system. And so this leads to wrap up on this notion of on this narrow meaning of basic income. This leads to the point that in their 2017 book, Philippe and Yannick argued that basic income constituted a third tradition, independent from that of public assistance and social insurance. And I would argue that's wrong. That doesn't hold, because what happens is that it seems to me the more correct way to see things, especially when taking account this narrow meaning, is that basic income can be argued for in either of the three independent traditions of so public assistance, social insurance, and what I would call socialized rents, theories of socialized rents. So public assistance doesn't need much demonstration as to why it fits into it. As to social insurance, it seems I think this becomes most obvious once you start taking seriously into account all the debates surrounding the definition of work. So once you accept the fact that most of the work being done in society is not made in employment, once you refuse the equation of work with employment, you accept the fact that most of the work is being done in society is being done outside of employment. And actually that's some of the most useful work in society is being done outside of employment. Then you can easily define basic income as a form of insurance mechanism, because everyone is already contributing. And what's lacking is just the compensation from this contribution. Yes. And lastly, so in their book, Philippe and Yannick associate basic income with the tradition of socialized rents. But we have two problems with this. Is that first of all, one of the main advocates of this notion of socialized rents, Henry George, with his notion of a land tax, was not a supporter of basic income. And then we have many actually. So there are many schemes exist today that rest on this notion of socialized rents. A lot of them are they're called usually sovereign wealth fund. And actually, of all the sovereign wealth fund that exists around the world, there's only one that pays a basic income. And it's the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend, and it only used a fraction of the money of the socialized rents of oil to be paid as a dividend. So anyway, that was for the narrow meaning of basic income. But the point also here is that if this existed, some of these schemes existed in 1986 already. So what was it all about? The creation of Bien, all these meetings, all this theory. What was it all about if this existed already before? So arguably, and then this is something that Toru's paper tomorrow morning would contribute to. My main argument is that from the very beginning, basic income has had two meanings, two understandings. One is this narrow understanding that has been narrowed down even more with the progress of the scientific discussion. And the other one is a broader understanding, the aspiration to the unconditional and universal guarantee of the material means of individual autonomy. And so the first point with this is that to ensure this broader understanding, most likely it will not be possible to ensure it only with a single narrowly understood, narrowly defined basic income scheme, or even with a combination of only narrowly defined basic income schemes. So in their 2017 book, Philippe and Yannick talk of basic income's cousin, and they have a list of policies there. I think basically that the list needs to be reworked a little, but my point would be that what's most likely is that to ensure the broader understanding of basic income, it would have to be done by a combination of, it would most likely be achieved only by a combination of basic income in the narrow understanding, basic endowments, basic income in kind, which are today known as universal and conditional basic services, and a fourth family, which I call weekly conditional income guarantees, borrowing the term from Alain Gaillet, whatever. And the point here is also that these three families of proposals, which are equivalent, in size and in scope and in ways of defining them to the narrow definition of basic income, have actually benefited a lot from the growth of the basic income discussion. They've actually discussion fostered by Bien really helped to narrow down these other families, and arguably because it seems to me because from the very beginning the discussion in Bien was aimed towards this broader understanding and looking at how these several different family of schemes could help to contribute to it. The problem is that so far they tend to have been presented as alternatives instead as complementary. and not enough thought has been dedicated to how they could complement each other and work together, essentially. The other point I wanted to make here, sorry,
sorry, just to let you know, if you 1 more minute, and we'll need to go to Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, basically the other point was that it seems to me that the reason why, the other question is why, if this broader meaning exists, why is it not used by anyone? So my argument would be that actually most basic income activists today refer to this broader meaning when they talk of the notion of a full basic income. But the problem is that from the very beginning, the notion of a full basic income is problematic because it was created in 1985 in a Dutch administrative report. And in that report, it had the meaning of being high enough, a full basic income would be one high enough to replace all other state-provided cash transfers. And this meaning was also taken up by the 2016 report that to see if experimentation could be done in Finland. Yes, but in the basic income activist community, when people use a full basic income, they think of a basic income high enough to allow a dignified existence and a participation society. And so the point is, these two meanings they can be put together. So if you sell all state services, if you replace all state services by cash transfer, it would likely be high enough for you to live, to live well until you have an accident, but they also can be very much opposed. And I think the overwhelming majority of basic income supporters and of the people who use the full basic income expression oppose this project of selling all state services and replacing them by cash transfer. And finally, so I'll basically conclude here because without the slides it's going to be a bit difficult to see, but my main point was then, depending on the positions to these two concepts, you can sort of remap the basic income debate. So from the total opposition, so opposing the broad meaning and the narrow meaning of basic income, to the partial rejection. So people that would argue for the narrow meaning but refuse the broad meaning. So they would allow this way of distribute resources, but only to the condition that it does not guarantee the material means of individual autonomy. Then you have two sort of limit cases which bring a lot of attention, but don't have, it seems, many actual supporters. So the notion that you would be able to, what I call the anarcho-capitalist hypothesis, that you would be able to guarantee the broad meaning of a basic income only by narrow meaning basic incomes. And the other limit case is the money-free, money-less, the money abolitionist hypothesis, that you would ensure the broad meaning of a basic income, but only by in-kind transfer. And then, then you have two other last positions, which are what I call the traditional social democrats, so who favor the broad meaning of a basic income, but who doubt that a basic income in a narrow meaning is interesting to get there, and the sort of typical basic income supporter position, who want the broader meaning of a basic income and believe that basic income schemes in the narrow meaning would be the most efficient way to get there. And just really to conclude, I think so. This is a conversation that is going to be going through this whole Congress, and I would just like to point out that the presentation that are going to be done tomorrow by Toru Yamamori and Ali Miller in the morning, and then the roundtable organized by Pierre Madden. And in the afternoon, there's going to be a roundtable, an open forum to discuss the issues surrounding this question of the definition of basic income, where there will be an interesting guest. Sorry, I can't see you. I'm still frozen. I think I'm going to try to log out and come back to maybe participate in the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much, Telemak. That was interesting. Lots of kind of theoretical stuff going on in this session, which is quite interesting if you like a wee bit of that, and I do from time to time. I'm going to proceed with questions now. We do have a question in the Q&A, which was put in there by Eugene Wang. Eugene, I don't know if you would like to speak to camera or if you would like for me to read out your question. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and I'll read out the question. So it was posted about 20 minutes ago, so it may be that there's some kind of response within the ongoing presentation. However, Eugene has asked, I'm a little confused about the improved participation, and she's asking, they are asking what you mean by that, what kind of participation. So I think it's for yourself, Tillymac, but if this was part of your presentation, do you want to respond to that?
The increased participation, I think it was part of the, I mean, Dominic and Victoria paper.
Okay, Dominic or Marius, do you want to respond then?
I mean, I can give some comments, and if Dominic has anything to add, then obviously do add something. Yes, I mean, essentially the the improved participation is a kind of catch-all phrase, or sort of a phrase that covers multiple bases, which is that a basic income, especially when tied to, for example, idea of citizenship, frees people up to actually engage in other parts of society other than their employment-centric or work-centric connections. It is part of the kind of, it's a political version especially, but also a social version of the idea of emancipation, ultimately, that comes down to. And the part of a kind of a very specific partisan version of that is that by virtue of its popularity, its demonstrated popularity as a policy, having that as a central platform in party politics could well steer people towards voting and engaging more with politics when they realize it's a classic kind of voting incentivized by being able to see clear outcomes of voting type situation. So rather than the kind of it being lost through the indirectnesses of bureaucracy and other things like that, and other kind of complex institutions. So there's a few layers to that kind of understanding. Dominic, do you want to add anything to that?
I can add a bit also, if that's okay. Regarding protest, also like it could be related to protest participation, and there is individual resource theory developed by Verba in 90s, I think, and it clearly shows that protest participation depends on material resources and on money particularly. So like another possible way to interpret this could be that like when people have more financial stability and more resources, they would also like take part in protest participation and other types of political actions, such as like not only voting but also petitions and yeah, other things.
Sorry about that. Victoria, thanks for that response. Does any of your co-authors want to add anything, or shall we move on to the next question? Okay, move on to the next question, and that is from Sean Kavanagh. And Sean has said, question for Marius and Dominic, your thoughts about what the enabling factors are for politicians to select certain historical and or contemporary philosophical approaches to basic income. The question is mainly about plurality. So if you could respond to that in perhaps language that will be understood by everyone on the call, Marius or Dominic, that would be great.
Dominic, do you want to lead on that? I can follow up.
Sure. So, I mean, it's a great question. And to be fair, because we had a very exploratory approach, it is by no means representative enough to answer such questions empirically. Logically, however, I would argue that it is really context specific, and that we really shouldn't underestimate the role that individual circumstances can play in this. So, stakeholders need to have certain ideas available to them, and stakeholders have limited time. So don't slap them with super complex approaches. Have something simple, otherwise they won't pay attention. Once they have access to that, it really depends on the way that the discourse around that is already dominated. This is something that we mentioned in our presentation already. If we have a discourse in which outside of UBI nerds, like everybody of us essentially, people only think of UBI as something, you know, let's take problematic slogans like it's neoliberal or something like that. It will replace the welfare state. It's the end of welfare. If that is the role that UBI is perceived as, stakeholders, even if they're pro-UBI, have no chance to push it through in a pro-welfare debate. So long story short, it's all about the way the discourse is shaped and it is perceived in the broad public. Marius, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that's a very eloquent way of putting it. I think another part of it is that because it's, and as we said in the start, because it's fundamentally a very succinct and very simple idea, it lends itself to multiple interpretations. And by virtue of that, because it sort of spirals off in many different directions and there's a lot of disagreement, it can lead people who aren't already, as we say, UBI nerds, to slightly pull back from the debate because they find it too overwhelming. So in that context, I think the clarity that needs to be provided is to show, firstly, what the different compatible combinations of UBI or basic income are with other elements in a policy portfolio. And secondly, to move away from the idea that it's a silver bullet. Just because it's a simple idea doesn't necessarily mean that it is the only idea. And we didn't really bring this up in the presentation because it wasn't as immediately germane to the discussion, but something which turns up quite a lot is this assumption that UBI is meant to fix everything. Every problem that there exists in society can be solved by basic income. Well, that's obviously not necessarily the case. It can possibly help, but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because it can't completely fix something, it is therefore without value. And I think moving the discussion into a more nuanced understanding of the expectations that can be placed on it and the combinations that it can be put with will be a very helpful way to make people slightly more, if you like, open-minded and nuanced in their reception of it if they are currently against it.
Thank you, Marius. We've got just over 10 minutes left here. We do have a question from Wouter van Eyck, which we're going to put up in a minute, but I would encourage anybody in the call who would like to ask a question of Anton around the way that we socially organise ourselves, or of Telemac, because all the questions are addressed to the middle presentation at the moment. Wouter, would you like to speak to camera and ask your question, or would you like for myself to read that out for you?
No, that's all right. I see now that I worded my question kind of weirdly, but it's because I cannot see the question myself when I type it. So I was wondering, as a question for Dominic and the rest of his group, I really liked your assertion that the UBI debate is currently at a deadlock of idealistic and seemingly pragmatic arguments, and that these flip quite often. But I was wondering, do you have any concrete suggestions of how to advance that debate beyond this injunction? Or was it just like a descriptive analysis of it? That's my question.
Okay, I can lead on this one if you want. I think in the interest of allowing people to also ask questions to other papers, I'll be as brief as I can. First point is this particular paper is a more diagnostic project in the sense that we want to establish what is, and we can obviously take that in multiple different directions for what happens afterwards. And the second one is that I think it poses certain challenges to us and to other advocates for UBI to show how many different levels we have to work on in order to make basic income persuasive. We can't just throw evidence at people who disagree with us. If anything, the last 5 or 6 years of politics in general should have taught us that simply presenting evidence does not necessarily work. We also have to provide other things as well. And carefully, affectively, rhetorically, etc., calibrated normative arguments are also very, very important. So we have to work on multiple levels, essentially, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Marius. Now I'm going to call on Liz Folksman. Liz has said that they would like to ask Telemac a question verbally. Liz?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. Really interesting presentations. Hi, Telemac. I want to try something out on you, and I'm just curious what you think of this. So I'm wondering what you would think about a distinction between what you term two different definitions of basic income. And that distinction being that one, what you call the narrow one, is what basic income is, and what you call the broad one is what basic income is for, or what it's trying to achieve. Because you could reframe, your broad definition as basic income is trying to achieve or is trying to guarantee the material means of individual autonomy, or basic income guarantees the material means of individual autonomy. And then you can have kind of one as a sort of, this is what it is in a very kind of pragmatic, almost physical way, and the other being, this is what it's meant to be for. And that, that second one is something I often try to grapple with in my own research, and I think can really vary very widely. Curious what you think of that.
Thanks, Liz. So basically, my response to this would be 2 points. The first is that though it's a very I mean, this is the case for a lot of basic income supporters, for what I call the typical basic income supporters. But the problem is that the broader meaning of basic income is not what basic income is for everyone. And most notably, for those who say what I call the partial rejection, I sometimes call the minarcho-capitalist position, who think that basic income in a narrow meaning is mainly for efficiency reasons, but not at all, but explicitly refuse the goal of the broad meaning of basic income, the broader understanding of basic income. So, for instance, the case in point here is Milton Friedman, who argued that basic income was, administered through the income tax, was a very interesting thing indeed. But it was less good than his ideal model to him was going only through voluntary charity. So this would be the first point. The distinction between what it is and what it's for is that it's not everyone think that basic income should be for this broader meaning. And the other point is that actually, as a matter of fact, the most of the basic income debate, I would argue, think of basic income in this broader meaning. I mean, this is a case that is going to be made by Toru more explicitly tomorrow morning. He's thinking of, is a 1 penny a year a basic income? So the thing is, if you take Bien's definition, the narrow definition, even if you put the uniformity criteria, 1 penny a year qualifies as a basic income, and it doesn't meet, the problem is that this kind of scheme doesn't meet any of the arguments that we are having, about basic income. What would be, this question, what would you do if your income was guaranteed? I would argue the question is not so much if your income was guaranteed, it's just that it's asked to people to whom their income is the way they guarantee the means of their autonomy. But actually the real question is, what would you do if the material means of your individual autonomy was guaranteed? So so this isn't the issue I would have with this. It seems to me that, as a matter of fact, the broader understanding of basic income, the broader meaning, is more in use than the narrow one, which is mainly used for social policy comparison purposes.
Hey, thanks. That's a great response there, Telemac. I've got a question here now from Malcolm Torrey. Malcolm, I'll just read out your question because the question is for all of the panel. So I think we'll go to Anton first, who hasn't responded to a question as yet. So the question is, have you developed or will you be developing research agendas for the future? And if so, where do you intend to concentrate your research work? So Anton, if you're still on the call, if you would like to respond.
Yes, so if I understand correctly, the question is about future research. Yes, so on my side, I will focus on the impact on the labor market more. So what I presented is this research is closed, or maybe I could try to estimate the savings, the administrative cost of controlling the household composition, which is an interesting question. But for the rest, in the future, I plan to look at the labor supply incentive of basic income policies.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm not sure if Malcolm was asking where geographically as well, or just in what kind of context. So I don't know if that's something.
Yes, well, I focus usually on Belgium because it's the context I know the best, but I think you can easily extrapolate a bit the results to similar economies. So.
Okay, thanks. Now we're drastically running out of time, and I've got another question here. So if anybody else wants to respond to that question, 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, sure, why not? Our group will drop a policy paper via the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, short FEPS, later this year for European universal basic income, with a fully fledged policy proposal and a list of all the arguments again. And we might be doing some work in the future as well, but that's still not public.
Well, we'll look forward to that when it does become public. Dominic, thanks. Telemac, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I'll be putting the slides that you did not get to see on the WUVA session page, and yeah, this will become a paper. This will finally become a paper sometime soon. Actually, I'll be presenting it. I'm hoping to submit it to Basic Income Studies by the end of September, and I'll be presenting it. So if any of you, if any Basic Income activist group is interested in discussing this, it'll be my pleasure.
Superb, that's great. Someone's just asked you if you would share your slides, so you've answered that question. And the final question, oh, I seem to have just lost the question. Alice, are you able to see the final question?
It wasn't so much a question, more of a comment, but also two people have raised their hands. So maybe if they have questions.
Sure. Alice, you want to call on them?
Yeah, Dina, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, hi. I have a couple of questions, actually. I have one question for Dominique and one question for Telemac and two questions for anyone to answer. So my question for Dominique is, you mentioned a lot normative in UBI. What do you mean by normative? And my question for Telemac, can we ever trace a UBI definition before the 80s? And to whom can we credit these definitions? And two more questions for anyone who's interested to answer. Are there any research on the effect of UBI on inflation? And the second one, who is funding research on UBI? Thank you very much.
Okay, 30-second responses, folk, because we were expected to finish at 12:05. Thank you.
If you want, I can try to answer that very briefly, at least the first two, so I didn't hear the end. But I think normative, I think I can, is in political theory, basically arguments of what should be. I think this is the way that the Dominican friends used it. And as regard the definition before the 80s, you have in this in the public here one of the best expert for this, Walter Weintraub, but basically an attempt to define basic income, you have actually only in the 80s, before Bien, you had the Berg in 1984, the Basic Income Research Group in the UK, which Annie Miller, who is here, was one of the founding members. But before that, you didn't really have attempts at defining basic income. You had the basic income proposals that all came with their own name, their own justification, and their own mode of financing. And the specificity of Berg and then Bien was to attempt to put a single definition that would overcome this diversity of name justification and modes of implementation to open a scientific conversation. So I would argue, no, it wasn't done before. Sorry, I didn't catch the end of the question.
It's okay, thanks, Telemac. I'm just going to bring in Troy because I think Troy's had their hand up for quite a while. Troy, do you want to ask a very brief question?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll be very quick. The question's for Telemac. Thanks for the very interesting session. You were talking about the definitions and specifically the Bien definitions, and we've got the 5 key characteristics that pretty much everyone's familiar with who's been around Bien for a while. But then with the 2016 General Assembly, we passed that resolution saying that basic income had to be stable in size and frequency and part of a program to reduce poverty. So is this 1 penny a month, a week, a year, really a sort of cute but pointless debate? That would be my question.
So actually, this is more a question for Toru. So I really invite you to bring it up with at the roundtable tomorrow with Toru and Annie, because actually, so Toru was key to the passing of this resolution, which has since disappeared from Bien's website, and basically his paper will be addressing this. So I think for a matter of time, this will be a great teaser for tomorrow morning's roundtable, and then we can also discuss it more, because in the first open forum on basic income's definition tomorrow afternoon, we'll have someone who was from the German delegation that pushed for the change in 2016 that would give his testimony of how he got there and the feedback and mixed feedback he received from this. So it will be a great time and place to discuss this. Okay.
Great, thank you for that, Telemac. I'll just conclude the session now. I think the chat and the questions will still remain within the session, so people can go back and look at that if they want to. I've also said that you can message other participants or people who are attending the call if you want to carry on a conversation with them. And there is also, alongside of the sessions that Telemac has promoted this morning, there is going to be a roundup session today, and that's at 6:30. That happens every day, and I think it's at 2:30 on Saturday, the last day. So do come along to that, carry on the conversation. Thank you very much to all the speakers, to Anton, to Dominic and Marius, and to Telemac. Thanks to Alice for doing the tech and the support. Thanks everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I'm just going to end the call now in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Susan.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.